a set of talks originally intended to be 4, now compressed into 2 because Michael's schedule has become rather busy with London government. And I'll tell you more about Michael in a moment, but first I'd like to say just a little bit about the kind of project that Michael and I have started to think about in relation to the crossover between some of the issues in multiculturalism and globalization that Michael will be talking about today, and a lot of what we do here at the AA in urbanism, and particularly with the extent to which architects are involved in urbanism these days. More and more, it seems that architects are being asked to showcase urban design projects for cities all around the world, and often it seems that the further an architect has to travel in order to do the work, the more valuable it is. This kind of what we might think of as deterritorialization of the architect's work seems to be running right in step with what we take to be a deterritorialization of the city itself. And this is something that, that Michael Keith has been involved in thinking about for some time. At the same time, it seems that architects are perhaps uniquely placed to be able to overcome some of the more debilitating issues and more debilitating problems that come about because of old styles of master planning that seem to leave us little way to integrate new kinds of development into older parts of cities where poverty and cultural difference are still that which defines the urban process. And so one of the issues that comes up is to what extent architecture in a self-aware way can begin to address some of the problems of globalization and urbanization in a global context. And this is something that Michael and I are interested in developing as a research project. So these talks have come about as a result of wishing to think about this in terms of a public discussion that we can begin here and that will hopefully give rise to some ideas about how we might move this discussion forward. Michael is professor of sociology at Goldsmiths University and also the director there of the Center for Urban and Community Research. And this is a cross-disciplinary program that has become quite well known for thinking about urbanism at the interface of design, culture, and local politics. And this is where Michael's background in local politics in London has also proven quite valuable. Michael has been, for much of the last couple of decades, the leader of the Tower Hamlets Council for his enduring suffering. But that gives him a unique insight into some of what happens in London, and particularly as we wrestle with new governmental structures to be able to deal with the boroughs that define the inner city and the inner periphery here. So I'd like to now introduce Michael Keith, who will talk to us for about an hour, and then we'll have some time for the beginnings of questions and discussion. Michael, thank you.
Larry, thank you. What I'm going to say today is both schizophrenic and compressed. It's schizophrenic because Moisten and Larry, when they actually asked me to come and speak a little bit in a program that has become slightly more and more abbreviated, asked me to come and say something about politics in London, since I must know something about that as a local politician. Increasingly, as I was reflecting on this, I'm not sure how much I do know, but the talk today is one that is coming partly rooted in my own deeply flawed engagements with contemporary politics in London, but also from the perspective of work that we're doing at the Centre for Urban and Community Research, which Larry was introducing earlier on. It's also compressed because there were going to be 4 talks, and kindly the colleagues at the AA identified a long period of time ahead in my own diary, slots for those talks. Unfortunately, this Thursday, the Mayor of London called an urgent meeting about the Olympics, and the next Thursday, the Minister of London called an urgent meeting about something called an Urban Development Corporation. This fact alone, I think, but both epitomises the pluralisation of politics in contemporary London, and also a degree of confusion in my own head. What I want to do, though, over the period of two talks, is something that I hope will be relatively straightforward. What I want to try to do is to convince you over the two talks in accumulation of the importance of multiculturalism to a reconstitution of the polis, to a reconstitution of city politics, firstly. I want to suggest, secondly, that if we begin to take multiculturalism seriously, then this does actually prompt us to think through ways in which we might approach political subjectivity anew. And I think thirdly, and maybe most importantly for this audience, that once that begins to be the case, if we begin to think slightly differently about how it is that the city comes to be politicised, how city spaces come to be contested politically, if we think about the ways in which, as Larry said earlier on, processes of cultural deterritorialisation re-territorialise parts of the city in slightly new configurations, then we might need also to think anew about the sorts of relationships that obtain now and in the immediate future between the city professions. In that sense, I'm trying to take as my guides both Weber and Walter Benjamin to try and think a little bit about how the curation of the city might restructure the way we think about the urbanist, the planner, the architect, the politician. And I want to try and do this over the space of two talks, the first of which will be mostly around trying to persuade you that multiculturalism refigures the politics of the city. It isn't a narrative that takes the institutions of London government as its heart, although they're there on the periphery, and people may want to come back to this in some discussion. But it is, in this first part, an attempt to suggest that we need to take seriously the curation of the city in order to understand the politics of multiculturalism. Before, in the second week, the second of these two talks, which are of course going to be the second two talks, I'm going to try to move into an understanding of how in contemporary London the boundaries between the plan and the architectural drawing, the boundaries of credentialism between the different professions that control the future of the city might be being refigured at this moment. Not only in the context of institutions such as Richard Rogers' Architecture and Urbanism Unit and its influence on the shape of contemporary London, but also in the ways in which, in those sites, those spaces of the city that are so hotly contested, an appeal to certain kinds of knowledge is used to try and reconcile different kinds of agonistic politics. Okay, so in doing this, there is clearly a sense in which I am an unreliable narrator. There is clearly a sense in which part of this talk is rooted mostly in East London. But in the spirit of Benjamin, when Benjamin opens the Berlin Chronicles, he talks about how to understand the city, to know the city, you need to understand the guides that show you the city. And he has these kind of 5 slightly perverse guides in Berlin Chronicles, one of which is Paris. And he points out that in order to know Berlin, I had to see Paris. And in that sense, I want to begin in 2 slightly odd places, which the first of which New York. Just a signal, I want to just take a short quote from Michael Sorkin's work, his work on Starting from Zero, where he says, "What is clear is that despite the currently soft market, some of the 15 million square feet of lost space needs to be replaced sooner rather than later, and downtown's dysfunctions repaired to allow the city's economy to re-establish jobs and networks lost in the attack. And the eventual need is not simply for replacement space." I could take you, and was going to actually say more about New York, but one of the things I just wanted to highlight is that in the very poignant debates that have surrounded what happens on Ground Zero, some of them highly aestheticized, some of them less so, there has been an almost observable calculus that appeal to certain kinds of what I want to describe as functional urbanism. The notion that there is a whole city, the notion that the city has specific and identifiable interests, the notion that the city has an economy, the notion that the city defines a polis, a political community. All of these, I mean, without becoming too theoretically obtuse, all of these in different ways cut against most of the insights of social theory that have long, in all sorts of very conventional ways, foregrounded the limitations to an understanding of the politics of the whole city, the appeal to the whole. The whole city may be a horizon, it may be something that we can appeal to rhetorically, but exactly where the city begins and ends, in its economy, in its political community, is perhaps slightly more problematic than we once think. And the roots of certain kinds of disciplines in a functionalist rhetoric is also one that has been subject to long-standing critique, and there's nothing particularly novel in returning to that critique. But what I want to try to do is to tease out just a little bit about what sorts of work is going on in the appeal to the interests of the city in New York, or for that matter, the interests of the city in London. When in London we have witnessed, just in recent weeks, the completion of not just the examination in public of the London plan, but also a new economic development strategy for the city, as well as a plan for the city, as well as an identified work programme for the Architecture and Urbanism Unit, that there is a sense in which the unity of London becomes part and parcel of the vocabulary of everyday life. The second starting point I just wanted to touch on was that of the weekend debate about Catherine Gunn. And it was only when I was just trying to get to grips with really signalling something I've been writing in a little bit more detail about, but I don't want to talk at great length today. And I was trying to get a sense of how I might get purchase on this, until looking at the Observer yesterday, there was a very kind of nice narrative about how, as people will know, Catherine Gunn was the GCHQ informant whose trial collapsed. And when she leaked to the Guardian, to the Observer, there's a story the journalist writes about a fear that at one stage they thought that as an informant she might be of South Asian descent. And that was a real worry, because it wouldn't play well. And if you think of the shots, the TV shots of Catherine Gunn over the last, both at the time of the arrest and charge and also at the time of the collapse of the trial, the kind of fair-skinned Aryan beauty that appeals to a certain kind of audience is highlighted yesterday, if you look at the Observer, as part of the strength of the case. There was a clear sense in which, sentimentally, the loyalty of one so fair-skinned could not be challenged. Although when you begin, the Observer has this slightly odd story about the way in which Catherine Gunn's own allegiances are partly conditioned by the fact that she was brought up in China, spoke Mandarin Chinese as almost a first language, and, God forbid, is even married to somebody Turkish. Her very cosmopolitanism begins to challenge the notion of loyalty, of sentiment, that is at the heart of, if you like, the nation-state's obligations that GCHQ represents. In fact, part and parcel of what I want to say is that at its most simple, the ways in which multiculturalism begins to challenge the political settlement is precisely because it takes us back to Immanuel Kant's separation of rationality and sentiment, to the ways in which, if you remember in Kant, there is this juxtaposition, straightforwardly, that follows on from the juxtaposition of rationality and sentiment between justice and loyalty. And most conventional forms, most narratives of nation-state building tend to, at some point, tease out the manner in which institutions, the whole political apparatus, appealing to the nation-state at a certain level, depends on some sort of congruence within these Kantian categories. And at its most straightforward, multiculturalism challenges the Kantian settlement precisely because sentiment transcends boundaries. And arguably, the tensions between the sense in which either diasporic communities with transnational links or global causes with transnational networks each challenge the fabricated boundaries of the state. What this means, very crudely, I'd try and suggest, and again, people might want to come back to this in discussion, is that when we think about the city and conventional urban studies, we might almost consider the ways in which there is a tradition of thinking about the city functionally. There is a tradition of writing in sociology, in political science, in anthropology, of the city as metaphorically an organic unit, and of academic disciplines trying to optimize the functioning of the city form, trying to make the city work in its own terms. There is also an honourable tradition of critical academic study, which begins to unpack the construction of that functional urbanism by exposing, if you like, the artifice of the Ricardian rent curve, the construction of political power, each in turn, if you like, the forms of critical urbanism rest in part upon different forms of deconstruction of that functioning city. It creates, very straightforwardly, a conventional understanding in writings about the city between certain kinds of technocratic language, technocratic debate about how you make the city work better in transport planning, in architectural form, in urban design, in city economics. But a tension between those forms of functional technocratic language and sometimes heroically leftish forms of critique of the ways in which property capital exploits some areas to the cost of others, the ways in which communities mobilize against various forms of property capital, various forms of development through social movements, and various other forms. And what I try and suggest to you is a very I hope maybe this might work as a metaphor, at least, is that almost in the spirit, Georges Perec talks about the need for a compass rather than a map of the city. And if we consider conventional studies of writing and thinking about the city on that west-east of functional optimizing and progressive critique, what multiculture does is it effectively complicates that with a north-south tension between the communitarian and the liberal. And what I mean by that follows directly from that Kantian positioning I was trying to outline earlier on. And I'll try and expand on that a little bit in the talk, but very, very crudely, we might think of the ways in which political communities owe their allegiance to those that they know. Or we might think about the ways in which the city is crisscrossed by regimes of power which structure the way people behave, which govern, in a kind of Foucauldian sense. I'm going to try and avoid kind of large tracts of philosophical or theoretical language, but those interested, this is kind of, in some senses, just a straightforward direction towards much of the writing around Foucauldian governmentality. But the sense in which different regimes of power structure the city and inhibit the ways in which change take place. So the tension between the communitarian and the liberal provides us with a north-south compass to the west-east of our conventional understandings of progressive or economically optimizing urbanism. And I think what I want to try to suggest is this becomes particularly important in the context of cities where the settlement of a city such as London, the political settlement of a city such as London, depends on appeals simultaneously both to justice and to loyalty. So if we are thinking about the dynamics of city change, if we're thinking about the politics of contemporary London, as we'll work through when we kind of touch on some of the fault lines of political debate, that there is a notion which local communities may appeal to a sense of solidarity that is spatial or ethnic or religious, but there is also a sense in which the political system structures the political settlement of a city such as London, partly in terms of the degrees to which the state chooses the right to intervene in land use planning, in the control of the economy, in the ways in which sometimes even the most trivial things, such as the regulation of everyday leisure life, will reconfigure large spaces of inner London in particular. What I want to try to do is suggest, and I'm afraid this is where the compression may begin to bite, is that if we begin to see the politics of London and London's change as structured by these sorts of tension, we need to understand some of the things that, and part of the debates that I'm trying to kind of touch on, relate to the rather specious debate that was in The Guardian last week, where you end up with well-known Marxian leftist economics professors from Cambridge making appeals to limit migration to Britain in order to sustain the sentiment, the loyalty to the nation state that nationalism demands. But what I want to suggest is that in the context of contemporary London, which rhetorically at least has embraced globalization on a scale over the last 15, 20 years, which not just rhetorically, but economically, it now kind of drives massive sections of the economy. When you think about the scale of change in inner London alone, much of what I'm going to say over the next half hour ties into East London. And I'm going to be talking next week about how we conceptualize the changing London, particularly across this notion of the Thames Gateway, a political intervention with which I have a kind of direct connection. But just on the scale of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, with which I'm most closely identified, with which I've been politically engaged for the last 10 years, just over the last 5 or 6 years, almost 45% of London's commercial property development has taken place in that one borough. If you just look at the Canary Wharf complex, the Isle of Dogs complex, the financial services district, Canary Wharf Group itself, which became an FT 100 100 company on the back of this extraordinary asset has generated almost 100,000, there will be almost 100,000 people working on the CWG estate by the time the buildings that are coming up through the ground are completed. In terms of just the work on that ground, and again, the figures I'll give you will be wrong, so please don't quote them, but they are of the order of correctness. A few years ago, it used to be possible for me to kind of make sense of the scale of that development in terms of 3.7s and 3.50s, as it were. The 3.7 for each, there was 7 million square foot up, 7 million square foot coming through the ground, and another 7 million square foot yet to come. And for each of those sevens, there was roughly 50,000 jobs. And if you just think that that is just the estate of a single company alone, the area immediately adjacent to it, in current government documentation, is expected to host approximately 250,000 jobs over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, all of that we know is at a time when, over the recent months, the commercial market has fallen off a cliff, when there is debate about the future of CWG specifically. But in terms of the scale of change, one of the things I keep on asking at events such as this, because I'm never quite sure, is that if you think about the daily commute population to the square mile, to the corporation, the City of London area, is about 300,000 people. Already, you're talking about 100,000 odd to Canary Wharf, Isle of Dogs area, and within a matter of a few years, you're looking at 150,000, possibly within 10 years, about 250,000. So you're talking almost, one of the metaphors that Ken is often seen to deploy in public when he's talking about the growth of London, which people may or may not believe, I guess, but is this notion of adding another Leeds to London over the next 10 or 15 years. But the point that I would suggest is absolutely real, is that, you know, a new mini economy of almost 250,000 jobs is partly about, I mean, the question I always ask at events such as this, which people, I'm still waiting for an answer from somebody, so maybe I'll find out for myself, is whether or not now, if you actually took out the square mile, the City of London, whether the Canary Wharf Isle of Dogs complex would represent an area of financial services employment that would be bigger than Frankfurt. It's certainly something that is actually beginning to be something that is quite close. So the scale of change, the sorts of property pressure that represents in terms of old-style confrontations between old communities and new communities, property capital and local interests, all of which generate the sorts of confrontations that you would expect, is partly about the way in which London has embraced globalization on a scale that has transformed large parts of the city. And in that context, the ways in which we choose to manage those kinds of flows of global capital need to be placed alongside the ways in which the flows of global culture might also bring challenges to the city itself. In a very straightforward sense, I want to come back, as I say, to more in the second talk than in the first talk, to the place of the different professions within this regulated or semi-regulated city. There was, in particular, Walter Benjamin in the Arcades project in I think it's in the first of the two drafts of Paris Capital of the 19th century. He says, Benjamin says, empire is the style of revolutionary terrorism for which the state is an end in itself. Just as Napoleon failed to understand the functional nature of the state as an instrument of domination by the bourgeois class, so the architects of his time failed to understand the functional nature of iron with which the constructive principle begins its domination of architecture. These architects design supports resembling Pompeian columns and factories that imitate residential houses, just as later the first railroad stations will be modelled on chalets. Construction plays the role of the subconscious. there's a very real sense, I think, in which the technologies of the global are translated into the architectural form of the city in ways which are sometimes slightly surprising. Construction plays the role of the subconscious. There's also the other quote I wanted to use from Benjamin was the sense in which he talks about how we need to think about the city as a kind of fiction that is inhabited by particular kinds of characters. Pierre Missac, when he's talking about the work of Walter Benjamin, talks about these as Benjamin's les types de Benjamin. In the Arcades project, Benjamin highlights, in particular, he says the concept of the engineer, which dates from the Revolutionary Wars, starts to gain ground, and the rivalry begins between builder and decorator, École Polytechnique and École des Beaux-Arts. And there's a sense in which he then plays out the notion of, if you like, the beginnings of a sense in which the architect becomes almost auteur de la vie. I mean, the sense in which the growing credentialization of architecture as a profession needs to be set alongside the ways in which the city is seen to be a problematic site of political intervention. What I would want to do if I had more time, actually, and there's a section of something I've written, is to suggest that if we're to begin to unpack the ways in which the professions credentialize themselves in terms of their abilities to intervene in moments of deep political contest, if we're to think, at its most, if I can just, if you like, signpost a couple of things just to save time, if we're to think seriously about the ways in which we are attempting to regulate contemporary London, then we do need to think about the ways certain professions are credentializing their expertise in a political context where the city is part of global, not entirely local networks, and in ethical contexts where the appeal to the nation state is not necessarily going to be adequate to justify the legitimacy of particular forms of intervention. I'm going to just use a couple of examples of the contest at a perversely micro level in just a second. But what that means, I think, and this is the bit I'd want to signal, is that we need to think through how the spaces of the city become seen as contestable. And in saying that, what I mean is that we need to examine how, at particular moments and particular times, whether in the formal public sphere of the town hall or in the alternative public spheres of the mosques or the dance halls or the sites in which cultures are reproduced, certain values come to be challenged and certain spaces come to be the sites of political debate. There is part of what I would try and suggest is that, and again, this will only be to signal what I would have talked about at greater length. We might look at the work of an artist like Hans Haacke, who uses the notion of curation and the fiction that is at the heart of curation to see how certain kinds of assembly bring together certain kinds of narrative form. And so if we are talking, for example, and I'll just give you one case of this, if we're talking about the East End of London, you find that there tend to be ways in which the East End of London stands almost as a kind of metaphor for Ellis Island, that it becomes a space to which communities migrate and from which communities assimilate or progress. And the sort of stories that make the East End of London visible as a naturalized site of migration imply a certain kind of process of curation, a certain kind of deployment of the tools of the trade of both cartography and history. That the place itself becomes a site of the changing same, if you like. It narrates migration in a way that normalizes a certain kind of change. And at the same time, I want to juxtapose this and with a suspicion of those kinds of narrative, those kinds of curation of the city. You know, Adorno, somewhere here, Adorno has this fantastic quote about being suspicious of the narratives of history, and Benjamin likewise talks about the Scotland Yard credentials, the detective-like credentials of the historian, and our need to be suspicious of this. Similarly, I think we need to understand that the ways in which the functional zoning of the city tends to promote, certain parts of the city are normal for particular kinds of activity. Certain kinds of the city might promote certain excuse me. Certain stories of the city imply a normalization of change or a normalization of staying the same. So much so that if you take something like Jonathan Glantz's London, he actually produces an appeal to a much greater London whilst attacking, and I think quite interestingly, the sense in which the bread and circuses of millennial London have produced a kind of almost hyper-real, fake alternative London. He talks about the grand projet of the millennium kind of creating this sense of, the Portcullis House, the Wobbly Bridge, the Greenwich Dome, as narrating London as a site of regeneration, of transformation, which is in some way fake, implicitly appealing to an alternative true London. A true London that at one point, interestingly, Jonathan Glantz's book is dedicated to Frank Pick, who ran the Underground at one stage, which again we'll come back to at one point. But he says what these politicians find hard to say because they have failed to deliver it is that London needs patient investment and long-term planning to ensure its future success, and that being a sentimental city beneath its cocksure exterior, its residents might choose, even if they don't need to spare some change for the poor and its down and outs, and even some thought for its key workers. It needs government to be less meddlesome in the working of the city's elected authority, and it needs a few more grand public projects like the Jubilee Line extension to prove to people that a bigger, better spirit exists than that which has been obvious over the past 20 or so shock-crazy years. So in Glantz's narration, the point I'm trying to make is that the city is curated as this kind of almost old patient that needs treatment, as opposed to this kind of glitzy fake that certain kinds of stories of regeneration promote. And again, jumping very, very rapidly, I think what that means is that we might want instead to think about alternative ways through which if we are suspicious of the historiography of these stories that make places like East London, the changing same, the sites of migration forever, or that make the city succumb to, one of the things that I know is contested in some of the debates around both the London Plan and the economic development strategy, is economic globalization is taken as a given. The function of London government, the function of politics, is placing London in a position in relation to these unchanging forces of globalization in a way that maximizes its beneficial impact on the city as a whole. And what I want to try and suggest is that if we begin to unpack some of these cartographies, we might begin to think just a little bit about how these spaces of the city actually begin to demonstrate global links of cultural deterritorialization and reterritorialization in a way that I was trying to touch on in the introduction to the talk itself. And what I want to try and suggest is that in order to kind of set up the debate for the second lecture, that I want to try and convince you of 5 related propositions which tie into the cosmopolitanization, that's a dreadful phrase, the increasingly cosmopolitan form of London's politics. And the 5 propositions are, in turn, I'm going to kind of talk these through in the context of some slides of East London. But what I want to suggest is that, first of all, what I've talked about here is both objects and subjects of government need to be considered in terms of their historicity and spatiality. Again, 2 not very nice terms. But what I would want to argue is that if we're to think about the debates about how London's form will change, if we're to think about how places like the East End become highly contested in all sorts of ways, we need to unpack the ways in which narratives of history and mappings of city function work. But we also need to think that through in the context of some of the dynamics on the ground. The second proposition is that in this context, racial subjects are basically fundamentally mutable. Those of you who've seen Amy Choi's book that's drawn a lot of attention for suddenly placing ethnicity at the heart of debates in globalization, will have seen where she tries to take forward the debate about whether globalization is deeply flawed by the ways in which capitalism promotes dominant ethnic minorities in specific contexts. So the tension between democratic politics and capitalism is realized through the prominence of ethnic minority market elites. Will have picked up just in recent times that a sense in which globalization seems to have kind of ignored culture largely in many of the kind of economic theories, but also in terms of thinking about its politics. The problem with Choi's analysis, of course, is that ethnicity sits there as almost primordial and unchanging. And what I want to try and suggest is that we need to think about how categories of culture actually both roll up and unroll in ways which are deeply politically contested. The third point I'd want to make is that we've witnessed, really across the cities of the globe, a period of time mostly identified with something called neoliberalism, quite often wrongly so, I think, but a sense in which the ability of the state to control, to shape the city, has largely been challenged. The sense in which, and part of the story I want to kind of return to next week, if you like, is that we need to, first of all, distinguish between neoliberalism and neoconservatism in understanding what is going on in places like London and New York at the moment, but also we need to begin to get a sense in which the return to planning, the return to the attempt to shape the city, is partly a product of some of the processes of cultural globalization that I'm talking about, part of the process of actually the challenge of multiculturalism. But over the last 10 to 15 years, most urban politics, most city politics have been shaped by a gradual stripping out of state powers and displacement by various forms of marketization. And I think this works in all sorts of ways, but in particular, what I want to try and suggest is that what it does is it changes the boundary between state and civil society. Something I want to kind of try and convince you in the last 10 to 15 minutes is that, one of the problems at the heart of much both contemporary politics in the grassroots, but also thinking about multiculturalism, is this kind of false analogy, false opposition between state and civil society, the heroic community juxtaposed against the devilish state. And I want to kind of return to that shortly. But the fourth of the 5 points I'd want to make is that, in a sense, there's a crisis of bureaucratic rationality underscores this crisis of faith in the ability of the state to provide beneficial change. And if we're going to think through what the resolutions are, we better have some idea about what the tensions of that crisis of bureaucratic rationality might be. And then the fifth point I'd want to make, just to conclude the talk for today, to kind of lead on to some things I want to work through next week, is that these forms of cultural transformation are always potentially subjected to commodification. Cultural difference is always preyed upon by processes of commodity formation. Running through these each in turn, the first point I try and make, that if you like, objects of government need to be considered in terms of their historicity and spatiality, that there's a sense in which there is an interplay that goes on in places like the East End. What I'm trying to argue, in short, to set up the talk for next week, is that we, in order to take multiculturalism seriously, we better understand how it emerges on the grounds of contemporary London. I'm just going to take three examples from just small pieces of work, but also from around where I live. The first and most obvious actually is the debate around the notion of Banglatown. One part of this, the area immediately to the east of the square mile, the city, has now been kind of formally recognised by the Electoral Commission as Banglatown. There's a long-standing debate. Jane Jacobs did a very powerful PhD, which became the book Edge of Empire, the other Jane Jacobs, the book Edge of Empire, which kind of explores some of the things I'm just going to hint at today. But part of the debate about the identity of this space is whether or not, by recognising the presence of a Bengali community in East London, that there is a way in which you either ossify these cultural flows, create this kind of exotic lump of London and call it Banglatown and wait for all the tourists to come by in some sort of dreadful charade of inauthenticity, or whether there is something more politically progressive going on. Don't really have time to go into these debates, but the point I'd want to make is that there is an interplay between cultural change and the politics of identity, through which a process of iteration goes on. Banglatown is one of those terms that everybody knows the origin of, and I can introduce you to 36 people who will all guarantee you that they were the person who coined the term, and at least 56 people will give you slightly different stories about the history. But what I think is clear is that part and parcel of the term is one of part and parcel of the history of the term is the process of call and response. The notion of forms of stigma being turned around into forms of valorization are precisely part of the ways in which the spaces of the city are reinvented and re-narrated. E1, abusively, in some of the National Front leaflets of the 1970s, was referred to as B1 for Bengali, or Bengali 1, the postcode. But the term itself, as you can see, is kind of reappropriated in all sorts of ways. I'll show the slides, I think, in quick succession to try and make some points. This is just a wall on the Chicksand estate, where a couple of the examples I want to use are those which begin to complicate notions of community. We sometimes think about the areas of the city as characterized in terms of community struggles against communities cohering in particular ways. The point I would want to make, of course, is that the moment you begin to look at the very category of community, it implies not only, and this is not just a straight critique of the metaphysics of presence, but it actually involves within it certain kinds of dynamic that trace in the sense of contemporary London bits of the here and now into spaces of the past and the future and always the elsewhere. So the fact is that I think it is now impossible, and this is the kind of short point of some of these slides, it is impossible to talk about the spaces of London now without thinking simultaneously of other places and other times, precisely because they are bound up in the spaces of the city itself. The Chicksound estate, this was just subject of highly contested excuse me, kind of gang clashes between kids on the estate, but also the graffiti on the wall, which was originally kind of taggers, became increasingly Islamicized. You see that you had one of the taggers who left the neutral zone was here, as the forms of hip-hop culture are appropriated in the language of Islam. The fairly crude notion which you had displaced by, again, a kind of a cultural form that is, in one sense, Islamic, in another sense, clearly hybridized, creolized by various forms of culture that are themselves looking at what is going on elsewhere. The point I'd want to make, there's a very simple point I'd want to make actually in this little part of the course, is that if you look at East London right now, there is a tendency to talk about the white community, the Bengali community, the Somali community. The point is that when you begin to unpick that way of storytelling, then what you find is that the processes of creolization, the processes of hybridization, the much more complex stories of community dynamics are very strongly present in all sorts of things. Most straightforwardly, in the contest between, on the one hand, Outer Valley Park here, which is named, it actually sits, those of you who are kind of fans of Ian Sinclair will know that Outer Valley Park sits on one of the ley lines of London. Obviously, it was named after a garment worker in 78. Again, one of the stories that is much contested is that it's also referred to as one of the Itchy parks, as one of 3 or 4 parks that kind of gave inspiration to Ichiku Park, the faces. It's also where the guy that chopped the head off King Charles is buried. So it has kind of extraordinary, kind of multiple iconographies tied to it. Interestingly enough, there's an old water fountain where Sinclair claims you look through the hollow of the water fountain and you look down the ley line of London, and that's where things happen. And actually, some of the contests that I'm talking about that are themselves took place, oddly enough, on that ley line. The point I'd want to make, though, very quickly, is that the very naming of the park has been contested for 14 years. It gets painted out and repainted with a regularity that is extraordinary. It's also a site where now the Shahid Minar, the monument to memorialize the language martyrs from former East Pakistan, this monument, which is itself a kind of interestingly kind of modernist aesthetic, created firstly in Dhaka, secondly in Oldham and other diasporic Bengali communities a few years ago in Tower Hamlets in the East End, paid for by members of the Bengali community in the East End. But the point being that this monument itself actually commemorates the struggle for a language in East Pakistan against West Pakistani Urdu dominance. It represents a moment of secular nationalism cast against the straightforward forces of West Pakistan. Part and parcel of the kind of the simple bit of the message is that on an ongoing basis, that the tensions between different versions of diasporic Bengali identity are played out in Outer Valley Park, in this one miniature space of the city, at precisely the same time as the conventional traditions of oppression, of racism, and its rejection are played out as people paint out the sign back and forth. So, in the one hand, some people created this monument to secular Bangladeshi nationalism at the time of the rise of Mujib Rahman when various individuals and groups, particularly tied to Jamaat, were associated in allying themselves with the West Pakistani Army's suppression of the Bangladeshi nationalist movement. It was the case that a number of individuals were forced, and again, those of you who know anything about that history, that time was incredibly bloody. That Channel 4 ran a documentary suggesting that under the war crimes legislations in the UK, it might be possible to try a number of individuals currently resident in the United Kingdom who were involved in the suppression of the Bangladeshi nationalist struggle. These issues are replayed on a regular basis and have been for the last 10 or 15 years. So alongside commemoration of secular Bangladeshi nationalism, you have simultaneously, it was actually, that was the most recent, individuals living in the United Kingdom being called in the local press, or in, not so much the local press, but in leaflets and flyers that are put around locally. And at the same time, the role of Jamaat in contemporary Bangladesh is challenged in leaflets that likewise resent the fact Saidi preached at East London Mosque a couple of times in the last couple of years, and also held classes in Outer Valley Park. The point I'm trying to make, in a very crude way, and I'm sorry I can't ordinarily go into much more detail, is that the spaces of the city through which identity politics are played out reveal that the sense in which you can only understand the dynamics of East London partly through histories of settlement, of racism and resistance to racism, but also simultaneously about the presence in the United Kingdom now of a diasporic sense of identity that ties into a figuring of the role of contemporary Islam. So that some community groups play out in particular festivals, and there have been clashes with the police. Again, all around this one part. The last of the issues I want to kind of tie out through the kind of contest of space is that this kind of challenge through which Bangladeshi identity becomes seen. If you remember the Demon Eyes, the Demon Eyes actually was pinched in advertising campaign by the Tory party from Al-Muhajirun, although people didn't quite clock this. Interestingly enough, when Al-Muhajirun stick posted the estates of East London, some of these, this is about, this was at the time of the election, of the Demon Eyes election, so 97 this was. The Al-Muhajirun posters were, as they invariably are, torn down not so much by white communities. I mean, that notion of whiteness itself kind of peels apart under any scrutiny, but we haven't quite got time for that. But by Bangladeshi residents themselves contesting the place of Islam within contemporary East London society. What I want to just try and suggest to you, in order to kind of set up the debate for the second talk, if you like, is that these forms of community mobilization can be characterized, can be narrated as in some ways autonomous. I think that is also deeply problematic. Part and parcel of what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to understand the banality of government. That these forms of mobilization take place, it's not just that the police are there. I'm not trying to say that just that the police are there, or that at times there's an appeal to the war crimes legislation. What I want to try and emphasize is that just as pick up any part of inner London, although this is East London, I could go to New Cross and produce 26 other stories, or go to Lambeth, go to Southwark, go all around the London itself. Just to give you a single example from New Cross, the ways in which the Abacha regime was challenged in Nigeria tied in extremely closely to diasporic links to Deptford, through which in Deptford itself, TV programs, radio programs, newspapers were produced and worked through network links back to Nigeria, which meant that the estate politics in South London around New Cross reflect global cultural realities as well as highly localized realizations of Nigerian exiled networks, which tie into debates about how the estate is restructured, which tie into debates about how the police work on that estate, which tie into every single form of activity, how Sunday church is regulated. It is impossible to think of a way in which the city is organized where government regulation is not, in some senses, impinging on the everyday lives of folk on the ground. In that context, we need to begin to think about a little bit more about how these spaces themselves, and what I want to move on to is the spaces where property capital begins to push for certain kinds of development that are resisted by local communities. We need to examine how those spaces, whether we think about the city fringe, the Isle of Dogs, Thames Gateway, the West London corridors, how the right to speak politically about them appeals to a polis which depends on certain kinds of regulation. It appeals on certain kinds of definition of the community. And it depends upon an analytic that sees the boundaries between those forms of regulation and the communities, part of the tension between the liberal and the communitarian, identifying a transactional boundary between state and civil society. It's trying to get beyond a sense in which some of the work that people like Leonie Sandercock, who if anyone has read her work, I find deeply problematic, precisely because it kind of creates a heroic realm beyond the boundaries of the state. And what I want to try to suggest is that very crudely, and this hopefully will open up the discussion for next week, that you might think about the settlement through which London's landscape has been regulated in the last 50 or 60 years along the very, very crude sort of typology that the post-Abercrombie settlement of London was almost represented, both for all of its flaws, that kind of high point of the Keynesian welfare state ambition to try and regulate the city. And the period of the kind of great social engineering projects from 48 to its kind of crisis in the lead up to the early 1980s represented a sense of bureaucratic power through which the shape and the politics of the city might be controlled by state agencies. The period from Thatcher, Reagan through to recent times represents almost an abandonment of that hope, a sense in which the deregulation of the city has occurred. But what we are now witnessing is the unsustainable nature of that. The fact that, notwithstanding rhetorics of globalization, there is a need to intervene in contemporary London, begins to make us think about how that crisis of bureaucratic rationality was placed. And within that, what I want to try and suggest in the next talk is that multiculturalism begins to pose serious challenges to how we think about the regulation of London and the spaces of its future, precisely because the value systems at the heart of various forms of political agency begin to be challenged by not just the kind of the demographic realities of multicultural, the fact that London witnessed almost 1 million new migrants between 91 and 2001, and nobody noticed until a few weeks ago. That's almost the way it seems, until suddenly we have the panic around the expansion of the EC. But multiculturalism more seriously challenges the settlement of the city, precisely because the appeal to the economic ordering of the functional zones of the city, the residential ordering of social housing or private housing, the interventions in the plan formed through agencies like Richard Rogers Architecture and Urbanism Unit, all of them appeal to a notion of political settlement which is displaced and challenged by multiculturalism. I'll leave that there.
I think we have time now for some questions. If there are any from the audience. Perhaps I'll let people think about this a moment while I get you to ponder one. I think some of what you're saying about the problem of, let's say, the separation between civil society and the state becoming a kind of justification for a listening to the people as victim, as though they were victims. Some of the students in housing and urbanism will have encountered the long history of that back to Machiavelli and the idea of the people as good because they don't do anything. And yet you now seem to have taken this a step further with the idea that the people become a sort of voice around which a kind of problematization occurs. They're a voice, in a sense, that we're led to listen to, but in the very listening to the voice, we simply reenact their victimization. We simply reenact their kind of placement within a framework that is already given by a governmental apparatus, such that the moment we call for a multiculturalism, where that multiculturalism means that we listen to the people, we're immediately caught in an endless circle. Is it something like that that you're describing as an initial starting point?
I'd have to say yes and run away, actually. But I think the appeal to participatory democracy, the appeal to a sense of local communities having a voice, is one that originates in a political territory with which I have much sympathy, which is to do with, naturally, is to do with a suspicion of the state, a suspicion of the motives of politicians, and a suspicion of the healing power of governmental interventions. Now the problem with that is that all of those forms of liberal intent, I think we now know, have generated a liberalism of the left, which has tended to, most obviously in various forms of anarchistic thinking, that has tended to valorize forms of community action on the ground. However, what we know is that in places not least like the East End of London, is that valorization of community action on the ground can valorize various forms of intolerance, of xenophobia, of various forms of community sentiment that we don't find quite so palatable. But also, the very valorization of community sentiment is tied into a debate with placing boundaries on state action. So, the language of social engineering, which I'm trying to suggest we are almost accidentally falling back into with the London Plan, with the London Economic Development Strategy, with a particular kind of engagement between architects and planning and master planning, which I want to come talk about next time. There is almost a return to an aspiration of social engineering and its professions that is occurring in a way which is neither necessarily left-wing nor right-wing. Part of what I was trying to say implicitly, if I make it explicit in the introduction to this talk, is that we have to understand that there is a communitarianism of the left and a communitarianism of the right, as much as there is a liberalism of the left and right. And part of the Parex compass notion is about trying to get to grips with the fact that if we are to, if we are to ask David Harvey's question about in whose image is the city to be remade, we need to understand that in order to try and produce a progressive politics around it, because we might actually wish for the arms, the apparatuses of the state at some times to produce certain kinds of intervention. And all of this might make some of that kind of Manuel Castell's city and the grassroots stuff begin to look a little bit kind of politically desiccated, because it doesn't quite provide us with a vocabulary to make sense of what's going on the ground. Is that sort of...
That's what I'm trying to push the point.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, without wanting to exaggerate, it seems to me, in a way, what's interesting about your argument is precisely that it doesn't make a rhetorical
But it doesn't make a kind of rhetorical privilege of democracy at all. That is to say, if you were to make an enormous rhetorical privilege of representative democracy, then obviously, in a sense, it has to be based around the state. Only that can organize it. Only within that can the legitimacy of representative democracy appear. On the other hand, and this is where I didn't quite see what you were saying just now about participatory democracy, because there it seems to me you don't particularly need the state, but you need an extremely homogeneous conception of the people. That is to say, for participatory democracy, for the people to have their will, you have to imagine an extraordinary kind of similarity, homogeneity, the possibility of the people coming together, not only in the sense of the polis, which I think is a profoundly misleading urban kind of model for what you're talking about. I mean, I remember Paul Hurst saying once that if we want to think about politics in the city, instead of always thinking about Athens and the 5th century BC, we should think about Damascus in the 11th century. And I think that's kind of extremely salutary. I think the point is then that what your argument places a great deal of emphasis on is something perhaps that people wouldn't normally turn to in a political analysis. It's actually a kind of discursive form, what you're calling kind of narrative. Now, it doesn't seem to me the idea of narrative carries with it a very strong sense of democracy. If by democracy one means essentially the practice of voting towards securing a decision or perhaps appointing someone who is elected. What I think, and I think many of the things you said kind of support it, a narrative has, first of all, I think a peculiarly urban condition. I mean, in the sense that one could say sort of narrative is to a city as perhaps a text is to a building. I mean, with a building, you're concerned with the sort of autonomous totality of the building as you are, if you're a scholar, concerned with establishing a text. They're both finished by definition. A city, like a narrative, is never kind of finished. And that unfinished quality, I think, is what profoundly links the urban to the narrative. Now, when you said about that park, I can give you 26 people who can tell me that they all invented it, and another 56 who could give differential histories of it. That seems to me entirely right. I mean, that's how the urban and narrative kind of work together. Just to make the final point, the political form, in a sense, that comes out of this is not, I think, democracy in the sense of representation or even of sort of participation. It's actually negotiation. And it seems to me, that is what you might call the fundamentally urban form of politics, for wanting to sort of essentialize it. that it's negotiation. And that also then goes together, I won't go into it, but with many of the arguments that you put up at the beginning, because one thing, that is clearly happening in the relationship of sort of globalization is a certain kind of weakening of national sovereignty. And the weakening of sovereignty often leaves conditions where, in effect, you have competing, rather like the end of the Middle Ages, where you have competing sovereignties or competing jurisdictions in which negotiation is actually the only way you can do things. It may seem to political theorists messy, it may seem lacking in principle. Those seem to me both very solid virtues.
I mean, I agree with large chunks of that, and I think I might or might not disagree with one or two parts. I think that part of what I was trying to argue against was a straightforward separation between representative democracy and participatory democracy, precisely because, whilst I think broadly what you're saying is correct, that most models of participatory democracy depend upon an institutional framing. They emerge in regimes of power and regimes through which the conduct of conduct is controlled. So they imply certain kinds of institutional forms themselves. And so one of the points I would try to make is that I think I take the first point on democracy completely and I agree with it, which is part of what I was trying to say in a sense. But the second point would be one that we just need to think through quite carefully the institutional forms through which different models of representative and participatory democracy are themselves exercised, and that's a kind of straightforward Foucauldian point, if you like. But it does mean that secondly, that if we're thinking in a more straightforward way about London as it is right now, that then we may have moved beyond whether it's the end of state theory or not, as it were, but we may need to think. There's three steps. There is within kind of mainstream political science kind of return to theories of pluralism that I find quite problematic in a certain way, because it kind of naturalizes what Rem Koolhaas talks about as the dynamique d'affaires. It naturalizes a world in which there are many different stakeholders, and that a stakeholder democracy, kind of Will Hutton-esque type process by which the description of the thing becomes a theory of the thing. And we might instead wish to think, and I'm sorry if this is a bit too obtuse, about, as you say, the complexities of this uneven world with different institutional forms of power, differently located, with different forms of democratic legitimacy, all in, crudely, a little bit of a mess in contemporary London. Not least, so this in a very banal way, you have crossovers between local government power, London government power, different European regulations, all of these forms of regulation impinge upon the spaces of the city simultaneously, and that creates this. I absolutely agree with this kind of complex of negotiation within these multiple regimes of power. I think, as it happens, the third bit, which you brought up, which is where local democracy sits in it, or local representative democracy sits in it, I think is an interesting equation. But it's part, I would say this is a kind of almost as a Jesuitical defence of a local government politician, maybe. But the part and parcel of what happens at local governmental level is precisely about the incommensurability of these different regimes of power, in turning one part of the city into something other than it is now, which ties into the fourth thing that you said, which is about notions of narrative, which is why I was trying to say that it becomes quite important how the spaces of the city are seen as sites for regulation and transformation in the context of these different regimes. Whether you see, I want to talk a little bit next week about the city fringe, for example, and whether you see that as being merely this kind of area of the city that is opened up by the city corporation for expansion eastwards, or whether you see it in kind of slightly more complex ways, I think precisely is about an appeal to narration, or that's what I would have talked more about Hans Harker's notion of curation, and the curation of the city in that sense becomes, I think, absolutely central to an understanding of the politicization of space. So I'm not sure I think that's mostly agreeing with what you're saying.
Yes.
In both of the cases of democratic participation or negotiation, you're talking about spaces of which two or more parties exist and they are talking with each other. Now, some of the examples that you showed us, which I think that was the strong part of the lecture, is reading other spaces which such negotiation does not exist. For example, the graffiti. You have groups that cover one graffiti and create another graffiti on top of that. So there is kind of conversation there, but it's not a democratic model, and it's not even market economy model. It's groups that exist in this area and are not present because they don't want to be present in the spaces of which other groups are talking, or the other groups won't actually acknowledge them. So I'm just thinking about what kind of model you can imagine, if at all, of spaces or institutions that actually can close this gap.
But you see, part of the reasons for showing that, and I think I'm going to have to blame everything on Ken Livingstone and Keith Hill. The thing I would have liked to have talked more about in those examples is that there is at the heart of those cultural forms a process of mimesis. I mean, one of the things that was implicit in what I was saying, is explicit in some of the things I've written, is that there is a kind of sense of mimetic urbanism where there is dialogue even where there appears not to be. Even the written a piece with colleagues about even the erasure of the Alpha Valley Park sign and then the repainting of it contains a degree of dialogue. I mean, the very fact that it's going on implies a dialogue. This may be a kind of naive statement on my part, but even with, I mean, the fact that contemporary Islamic mobilization through kids off Brick Lane chooses to use hip-hop style to represent Islamic messages, I think is saying something that's actually, in an odd sort of way, I think it's actually quite important, precisely because it is about the ways in which the appropriation of space, I mean, there's a piece we've written about the interplay between technology and communication and creolization, which means that even in these spaces which are seemingly so sites of great hostility, there are actually forms of dialogue going on which are potentially quite productive in all sorts of ways. Now, what any of that has to do with democracy, I think, is always in danger of kind of turning democracy into this beatific good, as it were. What that is about processes of deliberation, yes. What it's about is processes of contest, yes. Those are resolved through different means. I think we need to kind of unpack democracy a little bit as a notion, to just think through, what is productive or less productive about it. But I could say much more.
Yes, one more question.
Your notion of globalization seems to have almost an imperialistic core, and
What core, sorry?
an imperialistic core, where there's a kind of takeover of some land for other purposes by those who are more powerful against those who are less powerful. And I think the East End makes that terribly explicit. I think, for example, the term of the city fringe suggests that the city is the stronger power, And those people and those small businesses on the edge of the city are merely a fringe, a less important, a less in the construction of the city, very very unimportant part of the city, and the takeover of the so-called city fringe, which I would call Spitalfields, and rather than the city fringe, would suggest that small businesses have no place in this global economy, that the big boys in the city are the natural heirs of this, and that you spoke of some pride of the enormous growth of the financial market in the Isle of Dogs. Now, I worked on the Isle of Dogs for some years with people who lived there. They didn't see that it benefited them at all. That you caught yourself when you said that it's going to encourage the growth of these jobs. It isn't growth of jobs in the Isle of Dogs, or indeed on the city fringe. It's the replacement of some kind of work by other kinds of work, and workers from other parts of London coming to this part of London, or people from outside London. And in fact, the people who have lived here, as you spoke of it, this Ellis Island kind of area, are being displaced by rich and powerful imperialists.
You see, I mean, as you know, there's bits of what you said that I agree with, and bits of that I disagree with. I think that the point about, I mean, three things in turn. The point I was trying to make about multiculturalism actually challenges, I think, the simple narratives of the local and the local community. And I think one of the problems, the bits I agree with is precisely what I was trying to say. The ways in which you characterise, whether you call it the city fringe or whether, I mean, for what it's worth, of course, I mean, most of the definitions of the city fringe, whatever that term means, include a lot more than Spitalfields. They include Clerkenwell, they include parts of what's going on in King's Cross, and the, well, yeah, but I mean, the point is that it's a dynamic between two, I mean, how you characterise that space, I think, is actually quite important, because it's an economic space, it's a politicised space, it's the ways in which it becomes visible as something to be talked about and analysed are precisely about the ways in which we think about what is at the heart of this process of curation. Now, I think objectively, and this is what becomes quite difficult, is that it is just objectively not true. I know it is it's something various times that I have subscribed to, maybe subscribe to again, but it is objectively not true to say that the sorts of change that take place in sites like the Isle of Dogs bring no benefit to the local community. It's a good rhetorical stance, but it happens to be wrong, and it's wrong in the straightforward sense that, and again, this is demonstrable, but I don't necessarily say it doesn't make it either an unalloyed political good or anything less problematic. But there are very large numbers of jobs that move into the site. First of all, there are then a generation of all sorts of jobs of all sorts of income classes around the secondary activity that ties to that new employment base. There is also actually a phenomenal number of people who have got jobs on the Canary Wharf estate, from the estates immediately proximate, white and Bengali alike, into those jobs. And what tends to happen, for all sorts of very obvious reasons, is that they are priced out of living in that part of London, so they move out. So people are displaced, but it's not that local people don't get benefit. It is actually the case that almost by definition the people that are still stuck around don't get benefit, because the people that do get benefit, because very large numbers of people, as it happens, have got jobs in that area. But the fact is that if you are young, growing up in your mum and dad's flat in East London, and you get a reasonable job in the new financial services in Canary Wharf, you probably can't afford to live in inner East London, so you move to Barking, so you suburbanise. Now, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it the point I was trying to make about, you know, one of the problems with the kind of manual, Castell is only kind of a shorthand, if you like, but the straightforward stories of local communities against capitalism, crudely, which is the story you're putting forward, is I don't think it helps. It's important in some ways, in some dynamics, but it doesn't help explain all of the stories of what's going on. So very straightforwardly, you know, as you well know, one of the strongest movements that informed the community development group in the Spitalfields area and the development around the property development in that area was, you know, a group of Bengali restaurateurs who wanted to commodify that area as a kind of a site through which new forms of consumption would emerge, and are very strongly, bullishly for various forms of change in some cases. Now, the complexity of that, I mean, I'm tempted to say, well, maybe it's unfair because Jane Jacobs has a line in the book Edge of Empire where she says that after years and years, she always feels that the white left are always to be disappointed because the Bengali community don't conform to their expectations. And there is a sense in which, you know, I think there is a complexity to the sorts of change that are going on that are partly about the forces of capitalist change, but are not exclusively about that. I think that doesn't tell the whole story.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll close for tonight. Hugo?
Maybe this is something that we can really pick up on next time, but at a more general level, I think if we're to applaud the movement away from the period of the Thatcherite, in a way, rejection of a role of the state in the thinking about the city, but we're to try and rethink a way in which that role might be more valuable and be able perhaps to play a role closer to what you're referring to as a curatorial role, or to have some more creative role in what's been discussed perhaps as a negotiation. Do you think that there is a question of scales and of a range of scales at which different sorts of tools of curation and negotiation could be explored that would avoid us slipping into what I agree with you in terms of the London plan is dangerously moving towards a sort of technocratic and managerialist way of trying to think about how the state might be involved in thinking of the city. But from your experience on the sort of ground of negotiation day to day in local politics, do you think there are effective scales at which a new sort of curation of the negotiation about what should happen could be effective? So beyond the theory into some actual practice, which doesn't invoke community as if it were good, or capitalism as if it were bad, but is actually able to find ways of discussing the curation of the idea of the space and the life of the city in a more positive way.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I was trying to say was that the production of both, the pompous bit of what I was trying to say is the production of both the spaces and the times of the city actually condition the political engagements that result, which means that absolutely straightforwardly the scale of engagement becomes of enormous significance, but we need to think of scale in that sense as being more than a kind of a babushka-like framing from small to grand, precisely because part of the argument that I was also making is that if you think about the very ways in which the private and the public, the secular and the religious, the micro-geographies of configuration of the city are structured by the global through the multicultural present. So, in absolutely straightforward ways, it is not it is not possible to think about the ways in which, almost like one, this may sound a bit melodramatic, but it's kind of getting late at night, but it's almost not possible to think about almost a single way in which the kind of the micro-politics of East London has not been massively changed by the Gulf War, I think, for example. I mean, it is present in almost everything you look at a very minor level. And likewise, it always strikes me that the debates that take on board, what's happening now in Canary Wharf ties into a consideration of how Morgan Stanley might buy out Canary Wharf Group. So you have this company which has got fascinating multicultural cosmopolitan history to it that ties into a future that is between Morgan Stanley, Brascan, and maybe alternative futures, all of which assume this kind of great narrative of global capital, but at the same time in its minor detail, you find debates that will similarly cross the world, and it's not merely a matter of I'm not trying to kind of privilege the East End and what's happens in the East End and the Bengali community, but I do not think you can take a single part of London now without recognising that the dynamics that are at the heart of the changing forms of the city will inevitably draw on networks that are transnational. And so I think it is scale, but not in a straightforward way. But I try and
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I can take these last 3 points, or 4, and sum them up in the following way, and see if we can point a direction forward for next week. Hugo has just asked about scale in relation to curation, and the previous one of the previous questions had to do with looking at the city fringe in such a way that the city seems to be the primary force, and the fringe, that which just hovers as a bit of detritus around the edge of it. And then Mark also mentioned the point about dispute or negotiation being a kind of irreducible character or quality to the kind of democracy that we might be looking for. Now, maybe in a way these things kind of come together in asking questions about what architecture can do in relation to an urbanism for a multicultural era, because it seems that once you sort of displace, let's say, the usual plan or diagram that shows the city fringe as simply that which hovers around the centrality of the city, then one sees the power of architectural work to begin to ask questions at different scales with different orientations. And I think this is something of what we're after here. Is there a way of thinking about architecture as that which participates in a process where what we're trying to do is reveal the ongoing qualities and characteristics of the dispute, ones, in fact, which don't finish, as though architecture's role were simply to produce the right venue for a multicultural society? Of course, that will never appear. It's more that we need to understand architecture's role in a process, I think, that reveals the nature of this dispute. And this occurs, as you say, in many scales that run from Barking to your neighborhood. And this might be something that we can come back to over the next lecture and pursue further. But in the meantime, Michael, thank you very much for a wonderful start to this project.